right, welcome everyone to the Earth on Your Plate, why changing our diet is essential to address world hunger, world thirst, and biodiversity loss. So we will start by reading a land and labor acknowledgement and then introduce our esteemed speaker.
I am so excited to introduce to you all Mohan Gurunathan. Mohan is an engineer, entrepreneur, and activist who has lived and worked in Silicon Valley for over 20 years. Around 7 years ago, he became interested in getting a better understanding of climate change, the environment, and food sustainability. When I listened to Mohan talk at tUrn5 last year, I went on a radical reconsideration and readjustment of what was on my plate. I thought I knew pretty much all there was to know about where my food came from and who it impacted. I was wrong. I could talk all day about how profound and forward-thinking Mohan is, but I'll let him show you for himself. Without further ado, please welcome Mohan.
Well, thank you, Iman, for that very flattering introduction. I'm really grateful to be here. I want to thank you folks and everyone at tUrn and Kristen for giving me the opportunity to speak to an audience about this. So let me see if I can get my presentation going and then we'll get started. Okay, can everybody see the slides? Thumbs up if you can. Okay, awesome. Okay, so the title of my talk, as so graciously introduced, is The Earth on Your Plate. There you go, The Earth on Your Plate. Why diet change is essential to save our planet. So a couple initial notes. So to make the presentation more interactive, I ask you to use the chat. You can you can exchange your thoughts or just interject with anything. Or if there's something you want everybody to know, feel free to write in the chat. Occasionally I'll ask a question. You can respond through the chat. And because my talk is it's a bit long, so we're going to take 3 breaks for Q&A in the middle of the talk. And Emily and Iman will help me moderate for those breaks. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so you probably need no introduction to what's happening in these images. We're all familiar with the scary direction that our planet's headed in. We've already started to see some of these things occur, like the wildfires, the flooding, extreme weather we're seeing year after year are increasing. We're currently also in the middle of the 6th mass extinction of wildlife in the planet's history, and it's clear that humans are the ones to blame. So none of this should be news by now, and I'm sure it's part of the reason you're attending talks like this. So the first thing I want to say is thank you for caring enough to be here and to try to find out what can you do about this. Now, how many of you have seen or heard the recent speech by Greta Thunberg? You can throw a yes in the chat if you have. So Greta recently gave a scathing satirical speech. It was at the conference in Italy, and she basically, I thought it was brilliant. She read back a lot of the empty promises that world leaders have been making about what they're going to do about climate change. And then she punctuated it with blah, blah, blah. And I thought this was brilliant. It perfectly expressed for me the deep frustration that I feel that political leaders, economic leaders, industry continue to do nothing, and they focus on short-term profit, short-term gain, economic growth, and there's no really consideration of the long-term trajectory of our planet. And I found it deeply frustrating, disappointing, and I'm sure many of you feel that way as well. So this leads me to a common debate that comes up, and that's, do individual actions, if personal change, does it really make a difference, or do we need to focus on political system change? And there's lots of articles about this out there, and sometimes you'll come across an article that says, no, it doesn't make a difference what you do, what you eat, what you consume. We really need to change our systems of politics, our capitalist systems, economies. All of that has to be systemic change, and that's what matters. And I want to argue in my talk that, yes, systemic change matters, but absolutely individual personal change is essential, and that we're not going to solve many of our world problems without individual change. And I base this on a very simple reason. And that's because many of our global problems are tied to one overarching theme, which is overconsumption. So as a species, we're very hungry. We overconsume land, water, energy, oil, wood, minerals, etc. Anything you could think of, the earth can provide. And most of these things are only available in finite supplies. So if you consider an extreme hypothetical, if you and I and everybody stopped our consumption, many of these problems would be solved, right? It's simple, but I use that to demonstrate that we're all contributing to the problem. We all have a hand to play, and politicians are not entirely responsible, maybe partially responsible, but not entirely for our consumption, right? We are in control of a lot of it. And I'm arguing that we cannot solve a lot of our global problems without addressing our personal consumption and doing it on a large scale. Another reason I think personal change is essential is because personal change is the first step towards culture change. So as an example, let's say you make a change in your life to be more sustainable, like you choose to eat more sustainably. So obviously that's not going to solve climate change. But let's say because you set an example, or you posted on social media, or you talked with your friends and family, or you became an activist, let's say you influence or you inspire 3 other people in the first year to make that change, okay? And let's say each of them goes on to inspire 3 people, and so on and so forth. So how long do you think it'll take for this change to propagate to everyone in the world? So the answer is 21 years, less than 21 years. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not a very long period of time to transform the world to be more sustainable in some aspect, whether it's food, whether it's energy. We can influence each other, and the more we serve as multipliers, personal multipliers, the faster we can propagate change. So I'm actually arguing the most powerful personal action you can take is to work to inspire, educate, and influence others to be more sustainable. And the first step towards that really is setting an example by yourself. Sorry, is Kristen, I see a spotlight. Okay, it went away. So when it comes to personal actions, there's one thing that has been called the biggest way we can reduce our impact on planet Earth. And it's backed up by numerous studies. I won't go into that, but I can provide references if you're interested. And that is to avoid meat and dairy and to move towards more plant-based diets. Now, when I first learned about this, maybe 8, 9, 10 years ago, it was a real surprise to me, because when you turn on the radio or the TV, all you hear about is how fossil fuels are destroying the planet, and we need to stop burning coal and oil. And there's very little talk about food. And to this day, even though it's grown in popularity, or people know more about the plant-based diet, it still takes kind of a second place in terms of talking points relative to fossil fuels. So how can this actually be the most impactful thing? I think most people don't really understand this. And so the reason I'm giving this talk, and one of the main purposes of this talk, is to explain to you all the connections between what happens when you choose animal foods and how that affects the environment. And it affects it in many different ways beyond just climate change. So that's the crux of my talk. Okay, we're going to start with some simple biology. We'll go back to the carbon cycle, and I'll give just a brief explanation of how that works. So I'm sure you all know the source of all food energy on Earth is the sun. So a brief summary of the carbon cycle is that the radiation energy from the sun is captured by plants through photosynthesis. Plants take that energy and they combine it with carbon dioxide from the air, and they create compounds called carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And animals can eat those compounds. Some animals eat other animals. And what the animals do is they perform respiration. So they take oxygen from the air, combine it with that food energy, and they exhale CO2, and that's taken up by the plants. And that goes round and round in a closed cycle. So in theory, that's more or less balanced. What's absorbed by plants is exhaled by animals, and that goes in a circle. But what throws off the balance is when we put carbon in the air from other sources that aren't balanced. So when we take fossil fuels out of the ground, we combust them and we create carbon compounds that go in the air. And so that's clearly fossil fuels are a major problem. But another major problem here is cutting down trees, cutting down forests. And that's a major driver of climate change, because trees, there's only two forces in nature that really take carbon out of the air. And that's what's indicated by these two red arrows. So the oceans are one, and the other one is trees. And as we lose forest cover in the earth, we lose the ability to keep the carbon level under control. So another concept I want to talk about is trophic levels. So trophic levels are a way to describe how food energy travels through the food chain. So plants are the only living things that can take sunlight and make food out of it. So they're called producers. Plants are eaten by primary consumers, who are then eaten by secondary consumers, and so on up to the top of the food pyramid. Now, there's a law related to this called the 10% law. And every time, what the 10% law says is the following: every time you travel from one trophic level to the next, only around 10% of the energy is retained, and only 10% is available to the consumer in the next trophic level. So what that means is about 90% of the food energy is lost going up each step of this chain. So how is it lost? It's used for movement, metabolism, growth, bodily processes, maintaining body temperature. And a lot of it, actually, digestion is not a 100% efficient process. So a lot of food energy just passes through animals and comes out in the waste. So keep this in mind going into the next slide. So most humans consider themselves omnivores, okay? But I want to take a hypothetical situation where we have humans. Let's say we have a planet of 7.6 billion humans, which is the current population. And let's say we're all herbivores or vegetarians. If we were to draw a trophic level diagram, it would look like this. It's very simplified, of course, but we have the humans and we have the crops that we grow to feed us, okay? Now let's take another scenario. We take the same size of human population and we put them on a trophic diagram that looks like this. And this is where we take a lot of our nourishment by eating animals or animal products. Now, those animals have to be fed something, so you have the animals eating the plants. And so what does this do? Basically, the pyramid explodes. The bottom of the pyramid, we require roughly 10 times more water, 10 times more fertilizer, 10 times more land. And we also generate 10 times more manure, and we have billions of extra mouths to feed. And another thing that's implied, of course, this is a very simplistic analysis, but another thing implied by this diagram is we have more farm animals on Earth than we do humans. And indeed, that has happened. That's one of the issues that we're going to talk about later, but that's the situation we're in today. So the 10% law is a rough biology approximation. It's a rule of thumb. I'm going to give you some real world numbers from the farming industry. So when you use cattle to create food, you feed them 25 units of protein and you get out 1 unit of edible protein. So you lose about 96% of the nutrition that went into the cow. When you do it with pigs, you feed them 10 units of protein and you get 1 unit of protein out. So it's a 90% loss. And with chickens, roughly 4.5 units of protein in, 1 unit of protein out, so 78%. So sometimes you'll hear people say chicken is an efficient source of protein. Well, I would argue against that, because really you're losing 78% of what you put in. It's still a huge loss in food energy. And that's going to require more land, water, and fertilizer than if you were simply to eat the crops yourself. I want to go through another example in a little more detail, and this is a dairy cow. So let's take a look at what do you put into a dairy cow and what do you get out of a dairy cow? So a typical dairy cow will consume about 55 pounds of dry feed per day. And what is that? That is usually composed of hay or straw, plus some corn and soybeans. And they'll drink about 36 gallons of water per day. So that's what you put in. Let's see, what do you get out? Well, you get out about 70 pounds of milk, or 8 gallons, and 120 pounds of wet manure. And this is every single day from a dairy cow. So the first thing to notice is you get more manure than milk. And that's pretty typical of dairy farms. Dairy farms really are more like manure farms than dairy farms. But let's put the manure aside, okay? And let's look at the food in versus food out. So you put in 55 pounds and you get 70 pounds out. So on the surface, it doesn't seem too bad. But then you have to remember, milk is 87% water. So really what you got is mostly water and about 9 pounds of proteins. But the next thing you have to recognize is it took you about 8,000 gallons of water to grow all that food. Okay, so the final analysis, you put in 8,000 gallons of water and you got 8 gallons of mostly water. So it just highlights how absurdly inefficient it is to use animals to process crops to try to create food for humans. Let's look at a 2017 study, which looks at the amount of land necessary to grow 100 grams of protein for different types of foods. So I'm going to add a line here, and you can see everything below this line are all plant foods. Everything above are all animal foods, with the exception of barley, which is a strange outlier. But you can see the difference in the amount of land is quite striking. Like, for instance, compare soybeans to organic beef, and it's a difference of about 150 in terms of the land footprint to grow the same amount of nutrition. When you look at greenhouse gases, you see the same exact trend. Again, beef is one of the least efficient ways to grow protein and to grow calories to feed humans. Okay, so given the huge land footprint for animal products and the fact that in the US, people love their steaks and hamburgers, we're very cattle-centric in terms of our food preferences. Take a look at the land footprint that's required to raise livestock. So this is a diagram that aggregates all of the land used for a given purpose onto a map of the US. And about 41% of the US landmass is used just for feeding farm animals. Now compare it to this small area up here, the food that we eat. This is all of our fruits, our vegetables, our grains, legumes, all the variety of fruits and vegetables that we eat come from a very small land footprint compared to this enormous land footprint for animal feed. Next time you take a flight across the US, if you look out your window, I'm sure many of you have seen this before, and you'll see this kind of patchwork quilt over vast areas of the US. And I remember when I was a kid, I used to look out the airplane window and I wonder, why does the land look like a patchwork, like a quilt? And the reason is we have turned most of our country, and many wide areas of the country have been turned into giant farms. And the majority of this is to grow corn and soybeans to feed animals. These are areas that at one time used to be forests and marshes and wetlands and natural ecosystems that housed, many native wildlife that have been wiped out just to make room to grow this food. When you look at the world scale, the situation is the same. So this is a similar map of the world. And you can see the amount of land we use to grow food for livestock globally is about 27%. And that is equivalent to the land area of North and South America. And it's just staggering. If you compare it to the forest cover, we have it actually exceeds the remaining forest cover on Earth by a little bit. Now compare it again to the land that we use to grow vegetables and grains and fruits, and that's only 7% compared to 27% for livestock. But what's really striking about this is the amount of nutrition that we get from that area. So all of that area that's used for livestock products only supplies 18% of the global calories and 37% of the global protein. So you can see if we were to eat plants, we get an enormous amount of nutrition from a very small amount of land compared to what we get when we grow livestock. So here's another hypothetical. If we stopped consuming meat and dairy globally, we could recover land area equivalent to the US, to China, to the European Union, and to Australia. And all of that land could be returned to its natural state. And we could still feed everybody on Earth. Okay, with that, let's take our first Q&A break.
Looks like Claire has a question. Go ahead, Claire.
Hi, I was wondering why it takes more like landmass for organic foods than non-organic foods.
Yeah, that's a great question. So with organic foods, you're not allowed to use things like antibiotics. You're not allowed to use pesticides. And when you do that, the yields are lower, right? So you can't grow as many crops per acre when you don't use these chemical substances. And because of that, you need more land to grow the amount of food to feed the animal. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much.
Sure.
This isn't a question, but something that came up in the chat. Beth just mentioned that she took a train trip across the country recently. So depressing. Mile after mile after mile of monocrop fields of animal feed, interspersed with pasture and dead land that could be used for pasture or growing feed. So sad. Something I thought was interesting.
Yeah,
dead land
sure.
that used to be used. The reason it's dead is it was used for pasture or animal feed.
Or grazing, yeah. Yeah,
Or
grazing animals is very destructive to the land. Shall we keep going?
Claire, did you just unmute to ask a question?
Yeah, I guess I'll ask later because I just want to see more like, because I saw like the one graph with like the land impacts of different foods. I was wondering if there was like an environmental or like a greenhouse gas emission of like each food, but maybe we'll get that here.
There was. I'll go back to it.
Oh, thank you.
And you may be explaining this next, but those green areas you just mentioned that can be brought back, is there a way of ensuring that it gets brought back in the right way and not that big money, big business goes, okay, great, then we'll put more housing or more buildings on it. I'm just wondering, I mean, that sounds like another issue that could be hard to overcome.
Yeah, great question. There's always a risk that the land is used in the wrong way. But a simple fact is that's a huge amount of land. We don't need nearly that much land for things like housing or anything. That land is really, that scale of land is not useful for anything but agriculture. Like if you go back to how land is used in the US, you see how small the housing footprint is and the urban footprint is compared to agriculture, right? So it would be way too much land to be useful for housing.
That totally makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. That said, knowing humans would probably find some way to exploit it, but yeah.
Go ahead, Bruce.
I was thinking about this fake meat that's being made, chemically derived meat rather than beef derived meat. And there's a number of companies that are competing to make this happen. And I suspect that there's lots of things about the meat that doesn't really make it nutritious. It's a substitute for the taste and texture. But in wondering about how do we get a changeover from meat, pastureland driven meat into other things, that the artificial meat may be a way to do it, because we kind of hitch a ride on the huge marketing of artificial meat, which is intending to bring people away from regular meat, which is a good thing. So we can leverage the people who have left regular meat to go to other sources of protein that are other plant-based.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would say, many of the artificial meats are really not chemical based. They're based on just a mix of plant-based ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not necessarily, not nutritious. Some of them do have a lot of fat because they're trying to mimic the fat content of meat. Right. So I wouldn't call them health foods, but they're not necessarily, chemically based foods. They're not synthetic, and many of them are just made from ordinary ingredients like soybeans and oats and coconut oil and things like that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, the map of the United States, I think it said 41% or some ungodly percentage was used to grow beef. 41%. And then when you look at the world map, the percentage was much smaller. Is that just because the US is so beef oriented compared to the rest of the world?
That's a great question. I would assume that's because the US has a high appetite for beef. I don't know that fact for sure though, but that would be my assumption.
So it's 41% versus the 27, is that right?
Yeah. Though I've seen other numbers that suggest this 27 is maybe an underestimate.
Thank you.
I think we should move on soon. I'm just going to read one more from the chat, and then we'll have a couple other Q&As throughout the talk, but I just want to make sure Mohan gets enough time to go through his full presentation. So just one last question from the chat. Alexis asked, what are your thoughts on regenerative agriculture, helping soil regeneration, reversing climate change, etc.?
Great question. So we are going to cover that a little bit later in the chat. So I would ask her to wait patiently till we get to that point.
Great. So Mohan, would you like to go ahead and then we can meet
Sure.
back at the Q&A?
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you everybody for the great questions. Okay. I'm going to start the next section with a question for the chat, and I'm going to ask if you know the answer, don't put your answer in. I want people who maybe have an idea or want to guess to put their answers in the chat. How many land animals do you think we slaughter for food on a yearly basis?
In the US?
Worldwide. Okay, I see a 3 billion. 3 billion, 5 billion, okay. Okay, well, the answer is 77 billion, roughly. So it's way more than most people are aware of. It's just really a staggering number of animals that we raise and kill. And if you think about it, for every animal that's killed, another one has to be born to take its place. And if you really think about it, it turns out that one of the greatest human activities on Earth is the breeding and killing of other animals. And the question I ask myself often is this the legacy we want to leave for future generations, that we are such a bloodthirsty species in unnecessarily, all of this is unnecessary because we all know we can live without having to eat these animals. So it's a question I just wanted to pose to get people thinking about. We can't also forget about marine creatures. So any guesses as to how many marine creatures, individuals that are killed for human consumption? And it's okay if nobody wants to guess. I see 50 billion, 150 billion. Okay, good guesses. So the answer is, we think it's over 1 trillion. Yeah, we don't really know for sure because fish are not counted as individuals. They're counted by the ton. And also there's a lot of illegal fishing and a lot of marine animals that are killed and thrown overboard because we don't want them. So we believe the numbers in the trillions. Nobody knows. There's not really a precise estimate, but again, unfathomable numbers and a real tragedy that, hopefully this is something we can change for future generations. A really scary part is that livestock consumption is predicted to double by 2050. And this is driven by rising incomes in developing countries. There's a attitude that meat is a food for affluent and wealthy people, and also people are mimicking the Western lifestyle with our McDonald's and our KFCs. And so, unfortunately, we've set a bad example for the rest of the world, and hopefully, it's something we can change in the coming decades. Another major issue is what we're doing to wildlife. So if you look at the current distribution of mammals on Earth, you see something pretty shocking. 96% of the remaining mammals on Earth are humans and are farm animals. So the 4% here represents all of the bears, the wolves, the lions, giraffes, monkeys, all of the animals that should exist in nature. We've reduced them to be 4% of the biomass of mammals. There's really not much more room to increase livestock without completely wiping out the remaining wildlife on the planet. Okay, so we've touched on a lot of things so far. I'm going to dive into a little more detail. As I mentioned earlier, the food choices that we make as a society impact not just climate change, but many other distinct issues. And I'm going to go through those issues in some detail one by one, just to explain what the connections are. Okay, so let's start with climate change. We know livestock are related to climate change, but how exactly do they cause climate change? So there's 5 distinct ways that livestock contribute to climate change. The first, and maybe most important, is deforestation. So to grow food for animals, we are cutting down the planet. And this continues. Every day we're cutting down thousands of acres of trees to make more room to grow crops. And most of those crops are for animals. The second is methane. So methane, certain types of animals called ruminants, so that includes cows, goats, and sheep, they have a digestive process that they have basically a multi-chambered stomach, and the way they digest food generates methane as a byproduct. And methane is a very powerful heat-trapping gas. It's about 86 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So when that methane gets in the air, it has a very powerful effect on global warming. The third is methane and nitrous oxide from manure. So we get, from all these farm animals, we get a massive amount of manure. Manure also off-gasses methane and nitrous oxide, which is also extremely powerful. It's 300 times, about 296 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. The fourth is nitrous oxide is also emitted by all the fertilizer that's used to fertilize these fields. And the fifth is energy is necessary to just in the raising, the transporting, and slaughtering process, and that's mostly fossil fuel derived energy. So in total, how does this compare to the emissions from fossil fuels? So animal agriculture is commonly compared to be roughly the same or maybe a little bit more than all of the emissions of all forms of transportation combined. So that's said to be about 14.5% of all global emissions. come from both transportation and from animal agriculture. However, there's good reason to consider that 14.5% is an underestimate, and it's really more. And one of the reasons is because the 14.5% doesn't include what we call rewilding potential. So rewilding potential, we've already kind of touched on it, but if we could recover so much of this land that's being used for agriculture, it will soak up carbon dioxide. And by soaking that up, it makes getting rid of the livestock even more powerful. And if you factor that into the calculation, the 14.5% goes up to at least 28%. So you could see that livestock are a major component of climate change, perhaps as much as a third. There are also studies out there that show that even if we stopped all fossil fuel consumption today, we're likely not going to be able to stay under 2 degrees of warming unless we significantly change our diets. We touched on this again, deforestation. So animal agriculture is the leading cause of deforestation, particularly in the Amazon. So you often hear about fires in the Amazon. Well, it turns out those are all man-made fires. And about 80 to 90% of those are because of the beef industry expanding land to create more pasture and to grow more soybeans in the rainforest. So mass extinction. So again, we touched on it before, but by using up so much land, we destroy natural ecosystems and all the animals that live in them. And so the primary force driving mass extinction, again, is animal agriculture. So water usage. So here in California, we're in the middle of a severe drought, as many of you know. And the common things you hear are take shorter showers and go to drought tolerant landscaping. But the truth is the meat and dairy industry are the major consumers of water, both in the US and on a planetary scale. If you look at the water use in the US, only 5% is used for things like washing your clothes and taking showers and watering your lawn, whereas more than 11 times that 55% of US water use is to make meat and dairy products. And that's mainly in growing feed crops. So some tangible examples are a hamburger is equivalent to about a month of showering water, and a gallon of milk is equivalent to about 2 months. So really the best recommendations I wish we were hearing from the water authorities are to cut back on animal product consumption. So I'm sure you can guess what these are. These are manure storage on factory farms. So the top one I think is a pig farm. This is called a manure lagoon, and the bottom is an aerial view of a cattle feed lot. And this, I was shocked when I first learned this, but farm animals in the US produce about 130 times as much manure and urine as the human population. And there are almost no laws to regulate how it's treated or disposed. So a typical method is they'll store it in this lagoon and they'll let the water evaporate. And when it gets concentrated, they'll spray it onto a field. And a lot of it becomes aerosolized and airborne. And that drifts into communities, mostly underprivileged Black and brown communities, and causes people to get very sick. So that's a problem in many parts of the country. It also causes, runoff into rivers and groundwater and oceans and algal blooms and many, many different problems, including food poisoning. Another major problem is the use of antibiotics. So when you raise animals in such crowded, filthy conditions, the only way to really keep them from getting sick is to give them antibiotics. So it's very common practice in animal farming to give them antibiotics. So much so that about 80% of the antibiotics use in the US is for livestock, not for humans. Not only do they give them antibiotics when they get sick, but to prevent them from getting sick and also to make them grow faster. So This is what your doctor always tells you not to do, is to continue taking antibiotics all the time because you'll develop resistance. So we basically have created a perfect situation to create antibiotic resistant diseases. And there are cases where it's documented that diseases originating in these farms have appeared in hospitals, and people have been unable to get treated with medications because of that. So a related issue is pandemic risk. Here's a quote from Dr. Michael Greger. And he says, if you want to create a pandemic, build more factory farms. And the reason, I'm sure you can guess, it's a perfect incubator for the next pandemic. And as a testament to that, if you look over the last 200 years, the majority of global pandemics have all originated in animals, and many of them from animal farms. So I briefly want to talk about fishing. Fishing is sometimes omitted in discussions about animal agriculture, but by far the largest number of animals that we capture come from the sea. And we're capturing them faster than they can reproduce. So at this point, about 90% of fishing fish, what they call fish stocks in the sea, are either fully depleted. Part of the problem is our methods of fishing are very indiscriminate and destructive. And on average, so basically we deploy giant nets and catch everything when we're only looking for a certain target species. And then we throw back in what we don't want. And on average, about 40% of fish are unintended catch, called bycatch. So basically it's kind of a shotgun approach, and it's really destroying the life in the ocean. One particularly destructive method is called bottom trawling, and it's used to catch species that live at the ocean floor. So shrimp and prawns and other species at the ocean floor. And basically we drag a heavy net across the ocean floor and catch everything, everything along the floor. And it's basically like taking a bulldozer to the ocean floor. And of course you catch tons of unintended species, and the bycatch rate can be as high as 95%. So that's like catching, 20 pounds of sea life and keeping 5 pounds and throwing the rest back. So here's a picture of, what you might catch in a bottom trawling. Okay, I'm going to move briefly to the next topic, which I call meat industry greenwashing. So what's greenwashing? Greenwashing is trying to make the products look sustainable when they really aren't. And you're seeing more and more of this because the meat and dairy industries are realizing that the public cares about environment and environmental sustainability, and they're trying to basically appeal to the eco-conscious consumer. So I want to go through a few of these labels. I'm not going to go through all of them and explain really what they mean and what they don't mean. So first, let's look at organic. So what does organic mean? Organic means it's GMO-free, grown without pesticides or chemicals. The animals aren't fed antibiotics or byproducts. The animals must have some outdoor access, but a big loophole here is the producer can decide what that means. So there's no standard definition of what that means. But it does not outlaw some of the worst practices, the abuses that happen to animals. So organic does not mean that the animals were treated necessarily any better than other factory farmed animals. But what studies do show is, from an environmental and climate point of view, organic meat is no better than conventionally produced. And it may be worse because, as I mentioned in response to one of the questions, it takes more resources to produce organic meat because you can't use pesticides, you can't use antibiotics, so the yields are lower. How about grass-fed? So you're seeing there's a big push for grass-fed beef, and a lot of people are saying you can solve beef's sustainability problem just by getting grass-fed organic beef. Okay, the reality is grass-fed cattle actually grow much slower than grain-fed cattle, so they take 6 months longer to reach market weight. And during that 6 months, they're constantly emitting methane. Also, eating grass turns out to create more methane than eating grain. So you put these two things together, and it turns out grass-fed is actually worse for the environment in terms of climate change. So although the marketing is trying to convince people that grass-fed is a solution, it is not. So I want to talk about regenerative. This is a question that came up earlier. This is another movement that's gaining popularity, and it's based on some theories proposed by this man, Alan Savory. He gave a very popular talk some years ago where he claims that by grazing cows in a specific system that he devised, you can capture carbon in the soil and you can reverse climate change. And this is, sorry, I was just reading the comments. So this is currently being heavily marketed by the ranching and the beef industry. And they're saying, in fact, they go as far as saying that we need more cows and we should be eating more beef, and that is the solution to climate change. The problem is the science doesn't support it. Studies, there's many reasons it doesn't work. I could give a whole nother talk on all the reasons why this doesn't work, but studies show that yes, you can capture some carbon through grazing animals in a certain way, but the methane that they emit far outweighs any carbon capture that you get from the grazing. And there's numerous other problems, but that's really the fundamental reason why the system does not work in terms of solving climate change. So my advice, don't buy it. All right, I'm going to end this section with a few other solutions, which I find them rather humorous. So meat industry is really trying to solve their sustainability and their image problem. And so here are some of their solutions. The first is feeding seaweed to cows. So there's some studies that show feeding seaweed to cows reduces the amount of methane they produce. But here's the problem with that. Cows don't like to eat seaweed. It doesn't taste good. It's not natural for them. And we don't have a massive seaweed harvesting and transport industry ready to go that's going to feed 100 million cows the amount of seaweed that it's going to take. Also, the studies are inconsistent. They're not showing that it consistently works. Okay, so I don't think that's a real solution. Here's another solution that they're exploring is methane capturing backpacks for cows. So they're going to outfit millions of cows with these inflatable backpacks that capture methane. I'm not even going to comment on that. Here's the third one, methane zapping nose masks. Again, I don't know what to say. And the fourth, potty training cattle. So they're teaching cattle to go to the bathroom in a certain place so they can more effectively capture the emissions from the manure. The meat and dairy industry is spending millions of dollars on these studies, literally millions, maybe tens of millions of dollars on these studies. And you see articles saying, we have a solution for climate change, it's potty training cattle, when really the solution to climate change is so simple, it's staring us in the face, and that's not to eat these products. So with that, I will go to Q&A break number 2.
So Todd just shared in the chat, to reduce the economic demand for animal ag-related products, the price of such animal ag-related products in the market needs to be much, much higher. I recommend the imposition of a variety of taxes on animal ag-related commodity producers to drive up the prices of the animal ag-related products that are released for sale in the market.
Or we can also end subsidies to that industry.
I'm with
ahead.
you 100%, Todd. As you probably know, the vast majority of government food subsidies are for meat and dairy products, and a very tiny fraction goes towards fruit and vegetables.
Rowdy, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, they're more of comments than questions, I suppose, but I'd like to hear Mohan's thoughts. To Todd's point about the price, even if they had to pay to treat their wastewater, these big animal farms, do we have any idea what that would cost? And then I'm also wondering about regenerative agriculture and its impact on land use. As you already pointed out, Mohan, animal agriculture uses the vast majority of agricultural land. Does regenerative agriculture, does holistic beef take more or less land?
Do you want to like field?
CAFO beef.
Okay, so you had a few questions in there. So I'll start with the regenerative land question. Regenerative land absolutely takes much more land than factory farmed beef. Because soybeans and corn, we can grow them very densely. And if you keep the animals in one place, actually, another benefit of the factory farms for these producers is the animals don't expend energy roaming around. And when they don't, they grow bigger, faster. So that's another, reason that they keep them on factory farms. And yeah, when you graze animals their entire lives, absolutely, it uses more land. So we could not satisfy the current demand for meat and go to a fully grazed system. We don't have enough land on planet Earth for that. And could you remind me, what was your first question, Rowdy?
Well, it was more of a comment about how we get these products to reflect the true cost and their price, and even their wastewater. Like you were mentioning, hog farms, they don't treat their wastewater, they just spray it out. And so there's some talk if they had to treat their wastewater adequately, it would cost however many billions of dollars, which would then make their products more expensive. So just the externalized costs that this industry doesn't absorb, and instead we pay for directly and indirectly.
Yeah, good point. And I would draw an analogy to the fossil fuel industry, where they don't clean up their own mess either. And that has huge costs for society, but they're not held accountable. And, I think animal agriculture should be viewed from the same lens that the fossil fuel industry is.
Mary had a question in the chat. She asked, what do you think it will take for the media to start talking about eating less meat and dairy? How do we weaken the meat industry to do this?
Yeah, great question. I'll go back to what I started the talk with, and I think we need to, influence, inspire those around us and propagate this process of culture change, and make it more normal to be a vegetarian and vegan. And there's lots of ways we can do that, and that's talking about it, becoming active, setting an example, but also if you're so inclined, starting a plant-based meat company or getting involved in that industry is another way. But there are many different ways you can advance this cause, I think. But I think what we really need is a culture shift.
It looks like Karen had a question about seeing local farmland with cows on it. Karen, did you want to unmute yourself and ask that?
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. Hi, Mohan.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, great presentation. Thank you. I have a question. When I talk to people about all these impacts and the numbers and stuff, a lot of them say, well, look at all the cows on the local farmland. They don't have it too bad, and it's true. You see a lot of cows like, in the East Foothills near Mission Peak or Sunol Regional Wilderness or near Stanford, and they look pretty good. So my question is, what percentage of cows are raised that way? And I know that's not reflective of how most cows are raised, but what's the deal with that? What's a good answer for that?
Yeah, so it's a little bit tricky because for what I know, all cows actually spend some time grazing. So when you talk about corn-fed or grain-fed cows versus grass-fed cows, turns out all cows start their life on grass, on pasture. and then it's where they're finished or where they put on, the last bit of weight, whether that's in pasture or whether that's on a feedlot, that makes them grass-fed or grain-fed. So when you see cows out in a field, they may be, cow-calf pairs in the early stage of life before the cow has been moved to a feedlot. But generally, the way I would respond to that is, would you rather see cows out there, or would you rather see deer and elk and wolves and bears and things that really belong in the landscape? Because cows are not native animals. They didn't, they were introduced by settlers, and they actually do enormous damage to natural ecosystems. So I don't know if that would be persuasive, but that's kind of how I respond to that, that this is not a natural situation. This really should be, a natural ecosystem with wild animals.
Okay, thanks. So I guess a good answer would be they might spend a brief amount of time in the open space, but many will be transported to places like Harris Ranch or a densely packed feedlot somewhere.
So you're saying if they ask from a animal treatment point of view?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So if they're asking about animal treatment, then yeah, you could say many of those animals. In fact, not 97% of U.S. cattle end their lives at a feedlot.
T had a question also. They asked, do you think products like Beyond Meat do reduce meat consumption?
I absolutely do. Yeah, I think if you're eating a Beyond Meat burger, you're not eating a beef burger, and you're doing it because you want that taste and that experience. And so, yeah, I think one for one, it's replacing animal meat, and the environmental cost is way, way lower for something like Beyond Meat or Impossible Meat. So I do think it is a very powerful solution.
Great. So there is another question in the chat from Mirthi, who asks, I feel the people who have prior knowledge are the only ones who are interested to know more. But to the people who know about our advocacy, we are shut out even before we produce the facts. How do we change the vision of people?
Could you read that one more time?
Sure.
Sorry.
I feel the people who have prior knowledge are the only ones who are interested to know more. But to the people who know about our advocacy, we are shut out even before we produce the facts. How do we change the vision of people? I think maybe Mirthi is asking, but to the people who don't know about our advocacy, we are shut out even before we produce the facts. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mirthi. Oh, that's right. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so to the people who don't know our advocacy being environmental advocacy, or?
I think it's for people who, yes. Okay. Well, I would say there are always people out there who are receptive to this message who just don't know better. There may be people who shut you out, but it's kind of a numbers game. There are people out there who are just doing what they've done their whole lives, not knowing how damaging it is. And so I think you just have to talk to enough people, and there will be some people who are, impacted by your message. It may not be everybody, but you will, if you talk about it enough, you will find people who are willing to listen, I think. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. I think Mohan, if you're ready to move on to the next section.
I am, yeah. And I want to thank everybody. We're almost at an hour. I know it's a long presentation. Thank you for staying for as long as you have so far. Okay, I want to shift gears. This section is not too long, but I want to warn you, it does contain some images which may be disturbing. So if you are sensitive to that, feel free to look away. But if you're able to stay for it, I hope you are. There's some information I think that is important to consider here. Okay, so this is the image that we see in supermarkets and ads for animal products. And this is what the industry wants us to believe, that animals are raised in these beautiful rolling fields, and great cheese comes from happy cows, and animals are happy to give us their their eggs and their milk and their body parts. But the reality is more than 99% of the farm animals in the US are born and raised in CAFOs, or also called factory farms. And the primary goal of these farms is to raise these animals as inexpensively and as efficiently as possible to turn the most profit. And the animals' needs, their inherent, the treatment of the animals is really not a concern as long as they can efficiently grow them and slaughter and turn a profit on them. So here's a view of modern chicken farm. There are thousands of these all over the US. Chickens are the most slaughtered animal in the US, about over 9 billion every year. And they're raised in conditions where they're not even given the size of a sheet of paper their whole lives to grow up in. And they're in these dimly lit barns that are full of ammonia and full of dust. And all they can do is sit and eat for the 6 weeks of their life. Probably one of the most horrible things we've done is we've tinkered with their genetics through generations of scientific breeding. We've created a breed of chicken that grows immensely fast and gets obese very quickly. And because of this, it's documented that they suffer pain their entire lives in their joints. They suffer skeletal deformities, and it was all done in the name of profit. That we basically we've created a chicken that's trapped by its own genetics and destined to suffer. Here's a picture from a pig factory farm. So pigs are actually some of the most intelligent animals on earth. Their intelligence has been compared to 3-year-old children. And they're also extremely social and friendly animals. But on factory farms, they're treated like units of production, like all other animals. And they spend their entire lives behind bars where they can't even, in a stall where they can't even really turn around. And they have special stalls called gestation stalls where mother pigs are impregnated over and over just to make more piglets. So I won't go into the details of all of these, but you can tell from the pictures some pretty horrific things happen on these farms. These are basically mutilations that happen without painkillers, and they're standard industry practice. These are things that if you or I were to do them to a cat or a dog, we could be prosecuted for felony animal cruelty. But when it's done on the scale of millions of animals in a systemized industry, it's considered legal and it's actually sanctioned by law. But it's pretty disturbing to see what goes on at these farms. I want to mention 2 industries in particular. One is dairy, because when I first started learning about this stuff, dairy, I didn't see the problem. What's the problem with dairy? It's not hurting anybody. You're just taking milk from a cow. But it couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is that, like all mammals, cows produce milk to feed their young. And the process of getting cow's milk involves impregnating the cow so you can get a calf. But of course, you don't want the calf to drink any of your profit. So calves are considered a byproduct of the dairy industry. And calves are usually separated from their mothers the day of birth. Many of them are immediately sent to slaughter, but others are kept on farms like this. And if you look at this, it looks like a prison farm. But what it is it's a calf farm. And calves are kept there until it's decided whether they're going to be slaughtered or they're going to be raised for beef or veal. But these are calves that are ripped from their mother's side the day they were born, simply so we can take the mother's milk. And after 4 years of repeated impregnations, 4 to 5 years typically, the mother cows are sent for slaughter themselves. Another shock to many people is what happens in the egg industry. So I don't know if you've seen this, but the reality of the egg industry is that it has to produce a constant supply of new hens to lay more eggs. And that's because hens get worn out after a year or maybe 2 years, and they have to be replaced. And so there's a constant pipeline of new chicks being born. And there's several million of these chicks are born every single day in these giant factories that are called hatcheries. Now, in a hatchery, you can't control whether you're going to get a male chick or a female chick. So about half of them are males, and they'll grow up to be roosters, and roosters have no commercial value. So you have these workers who are on conveyor lines separating the males from the females. And what happens to the males is that they're treated as waste. And there's several ways that they're disposed. They can be ground alive, they can be suffocated, sometimes they're just thrown in the trash, and they're allowed to die of starvation or dehydration. So again, pretty awful things that the majority of the public doesn't even know is going on. When you eat an omelet, you have no idea that it's based on an industry with this amount of cruelty. So finally, I want to talk about the human element here, because we can't forget about the social justice involved in slaughterhouses. So how many of you grew up wanting to kill animals for a living? Can you imagine working in a slaughterhouse? I'd like to see any thoughts in the chat if you have them. So in the US, there are about 500,000 people who work in slaughterhouses. And they're some of the most violent, dirty, dangerous, and psychologically damaging jobs you can imagine. You know, jobs in these places include, 8 to 10 hour shift of stabbing struggling pigs in the neck with a knife, or, peeling the skin from an animal that is still twitching because, it was just bled out, and doing that for, long periods of time, and then going home and expecting to have, to have a normal life. Not only the jobs incredibly dangerous, so the industry has on average 2 amputations per week, but there's an immense psychological toll that these people face. Many of them suffer PTSD, extreme depression. The rates of domestic abuse and violent crime in these communities is much higher than the general public. And so you might wonder, what kind of people take these jobs? Well, they fall to the most underprivileged people in our society. So it's heavily composed of immigrants, undocumented workers, Black and brown communities, and they often work for minimum wage for long hours under abusive conditions. Many of them don't have a choice but to work in this industry. All right, let's do another Q&A session.
So once again, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, grievances, feel free to. Karen says, these people were especially impacted during COVID, forced to work amid outbreaks. Many died.
Absolutely, it's true.
Oh, Beth, go ahead.
I'm a little bit in shock from that last series, so it's a kind of a hard place to be, but not that I didn't know it, but it's always shocking to see it again. But I just want to say thank you, Mohan. I think this was a really excellent presentation. I've seen dozens and dozens of these and given that many myself or more, and it was really clear, and I loved your pacing. I love the way you engage the audience, and you have really great slides, and I think you're just doing a great service in the world, and just really appreciate and love you and that. Thank you.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you, Beth. I appreciate that.
Lisa, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. Hi, Mohan.
Hi.
So I have a question about something earlier on in the talk.
Okay.
if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
So I was recently talking with someone and about water usage, especially about beef. And he was saying, well, almonds are a worse culprit. And, I explained what I've read, that when you add the feed crops that are grown for animals, as well as the animals themselves, it actually adds up to a bigger water footprint than almonds. But he said, well, you can always get dairy from other places. So, but I think there's a shortage of clean water worldwide. I'm just wondering if you've heard anything about that, or if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, so almonds are very frequently used as a scapegoat if you try to bring up the water usage of the dairy industry. And it is true that almonds are a very thirsty crop. They do consume a lot of water. I have some other slides that I can dig up. But it turns out the water footprint of almond milk is around half, or maybe less than half, the water footprint of dairy milk. So dairy milk is still much worse in terms of its water consumption. That said, if you're going to choose a plant-based milk, oat milk is more water friendly than almonds. But an interesting thing about nuts in general is that nuts have an extremely low carbon footprint in terms of greenhouse gases, and some of them have a negative carbon footprint. So nut trees actually, because they grow on trees, nut trees actually take carbon out of the atmosphere. So that is a small benefit you get from nut products. That's the good news. The good news is we have a relatively simple solution to many global problems. We don't have to convince politicians or industry. We don't have to invent some new technology like methane capturing backpacks. We don't have to invest a lot of money. We simply make this choice already 3 times a day. And with a simple tool, we can solve many of the world's biggest problems if we can convince enough people to follow suit. So this is my slide that Michael stole, or my message that Michael stole. But eating plant-based is good for you. There's study after study shows all of the adverse health impacts of eating animal products. And the medical establishment is starting finally to come on board, with institutions like Kaiser and PCRM are touting the health benefits of a plant-based diet. And of course, Michael's organization too. This is a new one. A new study from 2021 shows actually a vegan diet potentially reduces the risk of severe COVID symptoms, potentially up to 73%, which is stunning. To think that by dietary changes, we could dramatically change the trajectory of the pandemic is just stunning. This is, on the order of maybe vaccine level effectiveness, and it's all just by changing diet. And I think the mechanism here is probably by reducing inflammation and boosting your immune system. We have many athletes around the world who shattered the idea that that protein comes from animals only. Actually, all protein comes from plants. We just cycle it through animals and waste most of it. And you see record-breaking athletes are going vegan, and their performance is only getting better. Here's another myth. You don't need dairy to get calcium. You can get calcium from so many different plant foods. We have really been lied to by the government and by the dairy industry to have the impression that cow's milk is the best source of calcium. Calcium is available in many, many different foods. And you may already be eating a lot of vegan food, even though you don't call it vegan. And for foods that you eat that are not vegan, there's a vegan version of almost everything these days. So the final message is very simple. What you can do is choose to eat plant-based whenever possible, as much as possible. If you're not ready to go vegan overnight, you start with small steps. You can make a schedule, pick a couple days a week that are animal food free days. Start with that and see how it goes. This is very easy these days. There are so many choices for plant-based milks. So if you're consuming animal milk, try to swap it out for a plant-based milk. And plant-based meats and cheeses have also come a tremendous way from where they were even 10 years ago. So give them a try, give them a chance. There are lots of programs online to inspire and motivate you to go plant-based. One of my favorites is this program, 10 Weeks to Vegan. So you can try that out, and you get an email subscription for 10 weeks that will help coach you on eating more sustainably. And going back to my initial comment about culture change, it's really important to teach people about this. Start with your family and friends. You can have them watch a documentary or share some articles with them, but we need to spread the message, and we need to start changing our society. Finally, remember that fossil fuels are not the only villain in our story. We're not just fighting them. We need to fight the meat, egg, and dairy industries just as hard as we fight against fossil fuels. So when you hear activists talking about fossil fuels, don't be silent and don't be shy in telling them that's not the only villain in the story. We need to really stand up against these dirty and unsustainable industries. I'd like to end with this quote from one of my heroes, Albert Einstein, who actually predicted many of these problems that we're going to have decades ago. And he said, "Nothing will benefit human health and increase the chances of life on Earth as much as the evolution to a vegetarian diet." And thank you very much if you stayed this long. I really appreciate your time. And I want to say thanks again to Kristen and to the tUrn team. I'll take a few more questions if there are any more questions.
Thank you so much, Mohan. Yeah, if there are any other questions, comments. So Audrey and Mary ask, will there be a recording of this presentation available? Kristen, I believe the answer is yes. I don't know the timeline exactly. Yeah, we don't know. But it is being recorded, and it will be going up on the YouTube. And possibly, yes. Those people who was right for the message last time I heard your talk, I really appreciate it. So thank you again.
Yeah, happy. I'm really happy, Mohan. I'm happy to meet you as well.
So if there are no further questions, I think we can conclude. Kristen, did you want to step in?
Thank you again, Mohan, for being a part of tUrn, for sharing this incredible knowledge that you've compiled in a really unique way. And we see a lot of climate conferences. We attend all kinds of climate conferences, like a lot of people on this call do. And I've never seen anything like your talk until I see your talk. So thanks for being a part of the tUrn Program Council as well. So Mohan is also advising me on the project, and that's really incredible, along with some other great people from around the world. And just urge you all to pass on the YouTube video link that I think Emily put in the chat. Does have Mohan's talk from last spring. There is some overlap. If you need to get to this content really quickly and share it with people in the next month or so, I would say go to the tUrn YouTube channel. Maybe that's still in the chat. That's one way to kind of access some of Mohan's work right away. And just do pass it on, because you saw how fast we could reach the whole world. And we do need to reach the whole world, especially people that have choices, people that have food choices, like many people, like me and many people on this call. So, if we have the choices, let's make the right choice. And yeah, it's so mirrored with our fossil fuel talk by Hersh Shefrin, the famous behavioral economist that we just had it too, because it was this combination of the economic lever of stopping the demand. this, which is the stopping the demand of meat, is this moral aspect, and then the economic lever of making it taxed at a higher rate, and then dropping those subsidies. So that three-prong kind of pressure of, drop the subsidies, tax, or add a price to it, and then from the moral point of view and behavioral point of view, just stop driving the need, right? And I think Mohan really speaks so strongly to that third gigantic part. And so if economics can't get itself together, if capitalism can't get itself together, if the government can't get itself together, there's this spiritual moral obligation to do what's right. And every human being has that power. And that's so uplifting after some of the things that we might consider that are harder to grasp in terms of how could we ever have an effect on something. Yeah. So great. Thank you so much, everyone. And the next talk is at 6 o'clock. It's on the arts. We're looking at dance, theater, and hip hop and spoken word poetry that's about the climate crisis. And then we have an 8 o'clock power hour. If you want to come to that, you can come online. You can come from New Jersey, and or you can go in person underneath the Kenna Trellis. Sounds like a nice place somewhere in Dublin, but it's just on Santa Clara University's campus, and it is across from the Benson Fountain. So Emily and Iman, who you see here, will be hosting that live, and then we have other students that are hosting the online version. So we urge all of you to reflect. Oh, you don't have to be a student either. You just to go on the online one. That's open to everybody. Not that y'all don't look like undergrads, but this is it's an open thing. So thanks. Have a great evening, everyone. And thank you for all your great comments.
Thank you.
Hello, Emily and Iman. Bye. Nice to see you
Bye,
guys.
everyone.
Bye.
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 Bye, everyone.